Throughout human history, there exists a vast emptiness spanning nearly 1 million years, a period that modern science still cannot fully explain. Fossil records vanish, the traces of our early ancestors fade away, and an entire chapter of our origin seems to have been erased from the timeline, as if by an unseen hand. This video will take you into that shadowed realm, a place of unanswered mysteries, near-extinction events, and scattered clues waiting to be assembled into a complete picture. Let this soft, calming narration guide you through the age between 900,000 and 800,000 years ago, a time when our early ancestors faced freezing climates, volcanic upheavals, extinction threats, and the most fragile moments of survival. Here, you will not merely hear about a historical gap, but instead embark on a journey to understand what truly happened, what disappeared, and what managed to endure long enough to become the humanity we know today. If you have ever wondered why humans survived among countless dangers, or what forged the resilience of such a small, vulnerable species, then keep listening. The story that follows may change the way you see yourself. As we close the door on the introduction and step deeper into the journey of rediscovering humanity's forgotten memories, another truth gradually emerges. The questions we carry are not born solely from curiosity, but from a profound longing to understand the very foundation of our species. And to begin, we must confront one of the most haunting mysteries of all: a crucial part of human history has vanished as if it never existed. If human history were an immense library filled with books written in footprints, stone tools, the ashes of ancient fires, and the fragments of fossilized bones, then the period between 900,000 and 800,000 years ago would be an entirely empty room. Imagine standing in a library that stretches endlessly, where thousands of shelves rise high above you, each packed with millions of stories, of people who lived, who loved, who battled, who feared. But then suddenly, you wander into a section where every shelf has been wiped clean, no pages, no inscriptions, no scraps of evidence that humans had ever set foot there. This emptiness was not accidental. It is not a printing error in the book of history, nor is it a time during which humans did nothing of note. Instead, it is a gaping tear in the fabric of evolution, so vast that even 21st century scientists step back when they recognize its magnitude. In natural history, such voids are exceedingly rare, and they usually signal something unusual: an extinction event, a global shift, or a catastrophe strong enough to sever an evolutionary line. And here, inside humanity's empty room, the surviving clues all point toward one chilling possibility: humankind once came dangerously close to disappearing from the earth. Archaeologists have long recorded that before this period, human traces filled the world. From Africa to the Middle East, from Europe to Asia. Stone tools, hunting remains, fossilized bones, all painted a picture of an active, adaptable, widely spread early human population. Yet around 900,000 years ago, those traces declined in a way that defies expectation. Regions that had once been bustling with life suddenly fell into an uncanny silence. It is as if someone pressed a button labeled "Delete all historical data." Sites that once yielded dozens of stone tools per sediment layer now offered only a few scattered fragments. Places that once sheltered thousands of individuals were reduced to barren stretches of earth. Archaeological layers, thick, dense, and continuous across hundreds of centuries, thinned out and vanished until nothing remained, forming what science calls an archaeological gap. What puzzles researchers even more is that this disappearance does not align with any known evolutionary pattern. If it had been caused by typical natural disasters, flooding, erosion, glaciation, the evidence should have been destroyed in predictable ways. But here, humanity itself, those who created the traces, vanished before nature could even erase their remains. Scientists have debated this for decades: did humans migrate elsewhere? Did they change their way of life, leaving fewer traces? Or have we simply not discovered the right sites yet? And yet, no matter how many theories have been proposed, none can adequately explain why various Homo lineages, well adapted to climate fluctuations and even previous ice ages, disappeared on such a massive scale. Even more troubling, this void lasted for up to 100,000 years. In evolutionary terms, that is not a brief pause, it is long enough for an entire species to be erased or replaced. The metaphor of a wiped clean library is not poetic embellishment. It describes a literal truth. All the pages that once recorded how our ancestors lived, survived, and organized themselves were ripped away, leaving behind a region of memory no one can reach. And within that silence, a single question echoes: what happened? Who, or what, erased billions of life stories? One of the most unsettling aspects of this mystery is how thorough it was. It did not affect just one region. It did not eliminate a single group. Entire human populations across multiple continents declined at the same moment. Archaeological data from the Middle East, Africa, Western Europe, and East Asia all agree, the traces of humankind fell to their lowest level in the entire history of the Homo genus. This spreading silence feels like the echo of a catastrophe, yet the catastrophe itself left no clear mark. There are no mass death fossil beds. No thick volcanic ash layers from a single catastrophic eruption. No unambiguous signs of an asteroid impact. There is only absence. A simultaneous, prolonged, inexplicable absence. This creates a painful paradox for science. We know there was a disaster, because humanity's traces disappeared, but we cannot find the disaster itself. That is why researchers often refer to this period with names such as the black hole of human history or the missing chapter of evolution. It is not merely an empty span of time. It is a direct challenge to everything we believe we understand about our origins. Seasoned researchers often describe the feeling of examining this era as walking into a vast room, turning on the light, and finding all the furniture gone, with only a few scratches left on the floor. You do not know what happened, but something, or someone, was clearly there. And its disappearance is the most telling evidence of all. Modern scientists believe that to understand the story of humankind, we must fill this void. Across millions of years of evolution, no other period has exerted such powerful influence on our ancestors' genetics, population numbers, and social structures. If this was the moment when humanity nearly went extinct, then it was also the moment when our defining traits, intelligence, endurance, cooperation, were sharpened and strengthened. This void is not merely a wound in history. It is the place where the identity of humankind was reborn. And here, the journey into the million-year mystery begins to grow clearer. For to understand who we are today, we must return to the moment when our ancestors stood at the edge of survival, and uncover why they nearly vanished. As the light of this story guides you deeper into the darkness, new data will emerge, genetic evidence will reshape the narrative, and discoveries powerful enough to overturn our understanding of human origins will come into view. From a library wiped clean, we will trace every remaining fragment to uncover why history contains a missing chapter, and what truly happened to humankind during that enigmatic age. Just as we find ourselves standing inside the empty room of humanity's grand historical library, a place where every trace of our ancestors has been swept away as if they never lived, a natural question rises: if archaeology has gone silent, then what else can speak? And within that silence lies one thing capable of preserving the truth better than any written page: the genetic code carried by every human alive today. From here, the door to the next chapter opens, leading us toward one of the most astonishing discoveries of the 21st century. When researchers realized that archaeology alone could not answer the mystery of this 100,000-year void, they turned to a different source of evidence: our DNA. Not fossils. Not stone tools. But the deepest imprint our ancestors left behind in every cell of our bodies. And within this seemingly fragile place, they uncovered a truth so profound that it left the scientific world in awe. In 2023, an international team of specialists analyzed more than 3,000 genomes from modern humans across multiple continents. Their initial goal was straightforward: to trace our evolutionary past through patterns of genetic diversity. But what they uncovered was not just a clue, it was confirmation of one of the darkest chapters in human evolution. Using complex computational models, they found that at one point in time, the ancestral human population collapsed to an extraordinarily low number. Not tens of thousands. Not several thousand. But only about 1,280 breeding individuals. A number so small that the entire human species was reduced to the size of a single small school. And even more startling, this near extinction did not last for just a brief moment. It endured for 117,000 years, a span long enough to erase any species that lacked exceptional resilience. These findings were not speculation. They were written directly into the architecture of our DNA, into the repeated sequences, the shortened regions, and the erased segments that accumulate over time. When a population shrinks too drastically, genetic variants disappear, much like a library reduced to only a few books, leaving its stories monochrome and incomplete. Biologists call this a genetic bottleneck. In biological terms, a bottleneck is a moment when a population becomes so small that its genetic diversity can no longer sustain itself. And what made the 2023 discovery truly chilling was this: modern humans possess less genetic diversity than a small group of chimpanzees, even though chimpanzees never experienced a catastrophe of this magnitude. In other words, our ancestors passed through a doorway of death that very few species could survive. These data helped explain what archaeology had struggled with for decades: why human traces vanished across multiple regions at the same time, why stone tools declined so sharply, why a long silence stretched across thousands of years. The answer now stands clear: it wasn't just the evidence that disappeared, humans themselves disappeared. From millions of individuals, the population collapsed to only a few thousand survivors scattered across the planet. These were small bands of people flickering like faint lights in the night of prehistory. A group of 30 could vanish from hunger alone. A group of 20 might not survive a single harsh winter. And a group of 10 had almost no chance of preserving a viable lineage. So what forced humanity into such a dead end? Geneticists could not name the exact event, but their data pointed unmistakably to one truth: something, either a single catastrophic force or a chain of calamities, shattered the entire human population structure. When you look at the reconstructed population graph derived from DNA, you see a curve falling, not gently, but plunging downward as if dropping into an abyss. And it does not rise again for 117,000 years of unbroken darkness. No civilization, no large species can ignore the significance of such a period. When genetic diversity drops too low, the immune system weakens, adaptability collapses, and subsequent generations face an immense risk of extinction. And yet our ancestors survived. This led researchers to ask the opposite question: how did they manage to survive at all? To seek answers, they examined the remaining genetic variants more closely. What they found was striking: the survivors seemed to carry genes associated with cold resistance, adaptation to scarce nutrition, and, most importantly, genes involved in brain development. In other words, during the darkest years of human existence, the foundations of modern humanness were already taking form. A gene influencing skull size. A gene tied to fire control. Another gene shaping social behavior. Together, these findings suggest that while most of humanity vanished, the surviving groups were not merely clinging to life, they were evolving rapidly to meet a brutal world. Genetic evidence also hints that this era reshaped human ways of living. Smaller groups, constant movement, deeper interdependence, and the early seeds of cooperation that define our species today. Gone were the larger communities of several thousand. Gone were the simple exchange networks between homo groups. In their place, small clusters of 15 to 30 individuals, living together across generations, forming the basic, survival units, of humanity. At this scale, every person mattered. Every individual was indispensable. And under such conditions, cooperation became not a preference but a requirement. Sharing fire, sharing food, caring for one another, and preserving oral knowledge became the keys to endurance. It was in this fragile moment, when life hung by a single thread, that our ancestors forged the most enduring of strengths, the combined power of intellect and unity. Genetics does more than tell us that humanity almost vanished, it reveals a deeper truth. Our existence is not accidental. It is the legacy of unknown individuals who endured unimaginable winters, endless hunger, and calamities beyond our modern imagination. When we look at the DNA inside our bodies, we are looking at their inheritance, the silent gift of those who walked through 117,000 years of darkness so future generations might continue humanity's story. And as genetic evidence opens the second chapter of this mystery, it leads us toward the next step in our journey. If our ancestors were once strong and widespread, what happened before the catastrophe struck? What signs foretold humanity's collapse? All of it awaits discovery in the next part of this story. Even though genetic evidence has lifted a small corner of the veil covering a past that seems to have been wiped clean, we are still only standing at the threshold of a far greater story, one that no DNA analysis alone can ever fully tell. Behind the numbers, behind the scattered genetic traces, lies an entire world that once existed, once flourished, once pulsed with life, and then suddenly vanished. And from here, we step into the next chapter, where the question is no longer, what happened, but rather, what once existed before it all disappeared. As we look back at the few archaeological remnants that survived, many researchers are forced to confront a startling possibility. Before the mysterious catastrophe that erased most of humankind, an ancient form of humanity may have been far stronger and far more advanced than we ever imagined. We often picture our distant ancestors as primitive groups wandering through the wilderness, living purely on instinct. But the deeper we dig into prehistory, the more that picture begins to waver. Ancient stone structures tens of thousands of years old, hints of complex social organization, and tools crafted with a sophistication difficult to explain, all of these seem to whisper a different truth. Humanity did not merely survive nature, but in some way, learned to master it. No one knows how developed their language might have been, how they structured their communities, or whether they possessed a form of knowledge unlike anything we understand today. But one thing grows increasingly clear: they were not weak. Imagine, for a moment, an ancient world that was not nearly as primitive as our history books often suggest. A world where communities knew how to manage resources, understood animal behavior, could preserve and migrate with the seasons, and perhaps even established early trade routes stretching thousands of kilometers. Discoveries of stones that exist only in regions hundreds of kilometers away from where they were unearthed suggest that long-distance exchange of materials predates the very concept of civilization. At the same time, traces from Denisova Cave and various regions of Western Asia show that our ancestors did not live in isolated groups. Instead, they existed in populations far larger than we would expect from the common, small tribal model we were taught. This paints an entirely new picture. Ancient humans interacting frequently, sharing tools, exchanging customs, and perhaps even competing for resources on scales far greater than previously imagined. Some theories go even further, that before the catastrophe, humans were gradually developing their own system of knowledge, not technological in the way we understand it today, but a form of superior adaptive intelligence. They may have understood climate patterns better than modern scientists, read seasonal signs through the subtlest signals in nature, or created hunting strategies requiring coordination and planning beyond anything we imagine. All of this forms an image of a humanity not only resilient but deeply experienced, a strength accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. But their true power did not come from technology or weapons. It came from their ability to endure conditions that modern humans could scarcely survive. Endless winters, bizarre droughts, unexpected waves of frost. To us, these are disasters. To them, they were simply part of life. And it was this ability to adapt to harshness that shaped a form of strength almost indestructible. Yet the greatest paradox lies here, just when this ancient humanity, arguably the strongest in our evolutionary history, reached its peak in endurance, cohesion, and survival, an unprecedented catastrophe swept across the world and erased more than 90% of their trace. This forces many experts to ask, if they were truly that strong, then how devastating must that catastrophe have been? No one knows for certain. Some believe it was sudden climate change, others lean toward massive volcanic eruptions, still others propose that an asteroid altered the planet's climate entirely. But whatever the cause, the event was powerful enough to bring humanity from formidable back to almost nothing. What makes this chapter of the story so compelling is not only the archaeological evidence, but the quiet, reflective unease it evokes. We, modern humans living in an age of technology, look back at the faint remnants of our ancestors and wonder, did they ever believe their future was unshakable? Did they think what they built would last forever? And it is here that prehistory becomes profoundly human. It does not tell the tale of a distant, unfamiliar species, it mirrors us. Strength does not guarantee permanence. Adaptation is not always the key to survival. No matter how advanced we become, nature needs only a single unexpected event to wipe the slate clean. When we look back at the world before the catastrophe, what lingers is not only awe at the power of ancient humanity, but also a humbling reminder. We are not a more complete version of them. We are simply the luckier one, lucky to live after nature delivered a crushing blow, and lucky to exist long enough to tell the story they no longer could. And thus, as we close this chapter, we move toward a deeper, larger question: if the world before the catastrophe was once so vibrant, what exactly happened that caused it to vanish entirely? And why does that 1 million year gap remain beyond every explanation we have? The answer awaits us in the next part. As we see O's the picture of a humanity once powerful before the catastrophe, a vast question immediately emerges: if they once existed with such scale, knowledge, and remarkable adaptability, then why are their traces so suspiciously scarce? What could have caused an entire world that once pulsed with life to fall silent, as if it had never been there at all? And from that silence, we step into the next part, where archaeological gaps are no longer mere misfortune, but perhaps a warning of something far deeper. In any field of research, data always speaks the truth. Yet at times, what does not appear in the data matters more than what does. And in the search for humanity's past, the archaeological void stretching across hundreds of thousands of years is what leaves scientists most unsettled. Not because we have not found enough artifacts, but because the absence itself does not fit the logic of natural evolution. The geological layers dating from around 1 million years ago and older are almost empty: few tools, few fossilized bones, few signs of human activity. A chilling emptiness. As though someone erased an entire chapter of history, neatly, cleanly, and utterly without a trace. Perhaps what is more frightening is not the nothingness itself, but the unnatural quality of that nothingness. Because before and after this time period, we find countless traces of human activity: stone tools, charcoal remains, butchered animal bones, and primitive habitation structures. So why does a near-absolute void exist precisely between two eras overflowing with evidence? Some archaeologists take a cautious stance, suggesting that the disappearance may be due to geological processes. Erosion, volcanic activity, shifts in river systems, or simply that we have not excavated the right places. But increasingly, accumulating evidence makes this hypothesis less convincing. No geological process can wipe out an entire continent's worth of evidence simultaneously. No natural event selectively erases nearly all human traces from one era while preserving those before and after it. So what, then, truly happened? The most plausible, and most chilling answer is that this disappearance was not random. It was the result of an extreme catastrophe powerful enough not only to kill humans, but to flatten landscapes, destroy all built traces, and even reshape the very ground on which they lived. When an event is large enough, it does not just cause extinction, it causes erasure. Recent discoveries of widespread volcanic ash layers, strange sediments mixing superheated rock with cosmic dust, and DNA evidence showing a sudden population collapse all support the idea that humanity experienced a wipeout event. An event that may have burned, drowned, or buried entire regions once densely populated by humans beneath meters of newly formed Earth. And yet, there is still something that troubles researchers: the disappearance is too clean. Not just few tools, but almost nothing at all. No shelters, no hunting marks, no hearths. The silence feels unnatural. More like a chapter torn out of a book than a chapter faded by time. Some suggest that ancient humans were forced into mass migration, abandoning their lands in search of safer places. If entire populations left at once, this could explain part of the void. But if they migrated, why did they leave nothing behind? No transitional layers, no disrupted cultural strata, no trail of incremental change. Migrations usually leave chaos in their wake. But here, there is only absolute quiet. Another possibility, far more troubling, is that humanity at that time faced a sudden, extraordinary event, one so catastrophic and so swift that they had no time to react. A devastating occurrence that erased an entire generation, perhaps an entire culture, before they could leave any trace at all. This was not a gradual environmental shift. It was a sudden blow, a literal natural reset. This forces us to view archaeological gaps not as missing data, but as a dark corridor leading into deeper uncertainty. If such a catastrophe could erase an entire era of humanity once before, what is stopping it from happening again? The feeling that arises when confronting these gaps is not just curiosity, but a quiet unease. Because the more we study, the more we realize we are following the remnants of an unfinished story, one that was abruptly cut short. And every new fragment we uncover only makes the void between them feel even more immense. For if humanity was once strong, adaptive, and deeply experienced, as earlier sections described, then their sudden disappearance without meaningful trace becomes even harder to understand. Their strength should have helped them endure. Their knowledge should have preserved them. But they did not survive. The archaeological void stands as the clearest evidence that no matter how formidable they were still powerless against a force beyond our imagination. What is more troubling is that the more evidence we uncover, the more questions arise instead of being resolved. Tools found outside the expected time frame, cultural layers abruptly broken, habitation sites erased in ways that feel unnatural, all point toward a difficult truth. The disappearance was not merely an environmental consequence. It may be part of a repeating pattern in human history, periods that rise, are rebuilt, then are swallowed once more by silence. And as we stand before this archaeological void, we do not face only the mystery of ancient ancestors, we face the fragility of ourselves. For if an entire world once existed and then vanished cleanly, then our story, despite our modernity and advanced technology, may also be only a temporary chapter in nature's long, unbroken book. This void, therefore, raises not only questions about the past. It raises questions about the future. And to seek answers, we must go deeper, into strange hypotheses, illogical data points, and possibilities we once never dared to imagine. Because in the next section, we will open the door to the boldest theories seeking to explain this eerie disappearance, ideas that may transform the way we understand the history of humanity. And as the archaeological gaps grow increasingly stark, as the complete disappearance of humanity during that period can no longer be dismissed as coincidence, we are compelled to search for explanations of far greater scale, forces powerful enough to shake the entire planet. For only a global, prolonged, and overwhelmingly destructive event, one that surpassed the adaptive capacity of any animal species, could erase human traces with such unsettling precision. It is from here that the story leads us to a decisive turning point in Earth's climatic history, a colossal shift known in science as the mid-Pleistocene transition. The mid-Pleistocene transition, MPT, was not a single event. It was not like a sudden volcanic eruption or an asteroid strike followed by a return to normalcy. The MPT was a climatic reconfiguration that unfolded over nearly 300,000 years. A slow, planet-wide restructuring that was imperceptible on the timescale of a human life, yet terrifyingly abrupt on the scale of geology. And within that turbulent current, our ancestors were cast into a survival trial so extreme that it shattered the foundations of their existence. Before the MPT, Earth followed 41,000-year glacial cycles. Ice advanced and retreated, temperatures rose and fell, all with relative regularity. These fluctuations, though harsh, still remained within the bounds that allowed animal species, including early humans, to adapt and thrive. But then, at some point around 1 million years ago, this cycle abruptly changed. The world shifted into an entirely different climatic pattern. Glacial periods lengthened to 100,000 years, becoming deeper, colder, and more brutal than anything that had occurred before. Imagine this shift as a nightmare stretching from one generation to the next. Winters grew so severe that ice was no longer a seasonal phenomenon, but the planet's default state. Lands once covered by lush forests vanished beneath tens of meters of snow. Rivers froze year-round. Plant growth cycles collapsed. Entire ecosystems were wiped out and rebuilt according to a new, unforgiving logic, and humans stood on the very edge of extinction. What made the MPT truly terrifying was not the cold itself, but the suddenness of the change. No one knows why this transformation began. No one knows what caused Earth to alter its rhythm. Some scientists suspect shifts in orbital tilt or disruptions in Milankovitch cycles. Others suggest it was triggered by a global drop in CO2. But whatever the cause, the result was unmistakable. The world became so harsh that no archaic human species could maintain long-term stability. In that context, the archaeological void we observe is no longer puzzling. Populated regions were wiped clean by ice. Valleys where humans once hunted were transformed into glacial rivers. Caves where they sheltered were buried. Entire continents may have been reshaped by ice streams sliding hundreds of kilometers, consuming every culture, every trace, every story left behind. Imagine the thousands or tens of thousands of people who lived during that time. Each meter the ice advanced meant a loss of territory. Each degree the climate dropped meant the disappearance of another animal species they depended on for food. Death did not arrive like an abrupt catastrophe, it came like a quiet shadow, tightening its grip through endless cycles of cold. And as the MPT progressed, the most frightening moment emerged: humanity fell to its lowest numbers in history. Modern genetic analyses show that our ancestors once passed through a severe genetic bottleneck, with population counts shrinking to just a few thousand individuals, perhaps even slightly above a single thousand. A number so small that any minor shift in the environment could have resulted in complete extinction. Nor were humans the only ones affected. Entire groups of large mammals were wiped out. Temperate zone animals declined dramatically. Plant life reorganized itself. Vast grasslands were replaced by endless ice. This was not an ordinary ice age. This was a climatic reset, the largest the biosphere had experienced in nearly 1 million years. Some hypotheses even propose that the MPT split ancient human groups into isolated branches, making gene flow and cultural exchange impossible. Prolonged isolation over tens of thousands of years caused many groups to vanish entirely, leaving no archaeological evidence. Only those who survived within tiny, climate refuges, regions with more tolerable temperatures, were able to continue existing. It is this extreme severity that explains why archaeological evidence from that era is so fragmented, ice crushed, erosion erased, and time layered dozens of new strata atop the places where life once flourished. What we see today are only scattered remnants lucky enough to escape the climate's destructive machinery. But the story does not end there. If the MPT was powerful enough to wipe out primitive human cultures, then what allowed a small handful of our ancestors to survive? What did they rely on? What knowledge, strategies, or biological shifts enabled them to withstand the longest and most violent climatic upheaval in human history? The answer lies in the next chapter, where nature becomes not only an adversary, but the stage for unprecedented battles for survival. For after the MPT, humanity did not face only extreme cold. It faced something even more terrifying: supervolcanic eruptions, ash-darkened winters, and seemingly endless periods of global darkness. And it was these forces that reshaped the entire trajectory of human evolution. Let us step forward into the darkest era, a time when Earth was not only frozen, but burning. And as the climate entered the chaotic orbit of the mid-Pleistocene transition, when the ice had already pushed humanity to the brink of extinction. You might think the suffering had reached its lowest point. But it had not. The Earth did not stop there. Those climatic upheavals were only the opening chapter of an even greater chain of catastrophes, events so powerful that a single occurrence could be enough to erase nearly all life from the planet. The ice had crushed the ground beneath humanity's feet, but what came next would sweep away the sky above them. For behind the endless cold awaited something far more terrifying. Supervolcano eruptions, and volcanic winters that cast the world into a darkness so long and so deep it seemed eternal. Since the birth of Earth, volcanoes have been the silent arteries of the planet, creating continents, reshaping the atmosphere, and sustaining life with minerals from the deep. But they are also its quiet destroyers, holding enough power to paralyze the entire biosphere in mere weeks. During the era humans passed through their million-year gap, geological evidence shows that the planet endured not just one, but a series of supervolcanic eruptions occurring almost back-to-back. These were not ordinary eruptions like the ones we see in Iceland or Hawaii today. A supervolcano is thousands of times more powerful. It does not simply blow off a mountaintop. It destroys entire regions spanning thousands of kilometers, ejecting hundreds of billions of tons of ash into the stratosphere, dimming sunlight as if someone were slowly extinguishing the sun itself. Even imagining a single eruption on the scale of Toba, 74,000 years ago, nearly wiping out the entire human species, is enough to grasp the magnitude of destruction. But what made the period between 900,000 and 800,000 years ago more terrifying was the frequency. Not one, but many supervolcanoes erupted, nearly back-to-back. The land cracked open. The atmosphere filled with ash, dust, and sulfur dioxide thick enough to obscure the sun for years. And when the sun disappeared, everything began to die. Vast forests withered and collapsed for lack of light. Plant life shut down, breaking the food chain at its roots. Global temperatures plummeted within months, triggering volcanic winters more severe than any glacial period. Large animals, already weakened by the unstable climate of the MPT, were pushed into mass extinction. And humans, already reduced to only a few thousand individuals, faced yet another blow from nature, so powerful it is astonishing that any of them survived at all. Imagine the scene: you are a member of an ancient human group living in sparse forests of Africa or the grasslands of Eurasia. One day, the sun becomes dim. Light fades gradually. The sky turns a murky purple. A fine black snow of ash settles over everything. Children cough constantly. Water changes color. Wildlife flees in panic. And then, true darkness arrives. Not for one night. Not for a week. But for years without clear daylight. The ash and sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere reflected heat back into space, plunging Earth into abrupt deep freezes, far beyond what any species could quickly adapt to. Temperatures may have dropped by as much as 10 degrees Celsius within months. A decline sufficient to collapse entire ecosystems. Early humans had no warm clothing, no sturdy shelters, no stocked reserves of food. They had only makeshift caves and fragile fires, if they were fortunate enough to have fire at all. In such conditions, each day of survival was a victory. And any minor change in the environment could cause an entire human group to vanish from history. As ash blanketed the land, plants died en masse. With no roots, no fruits, no vegetation left, animals collapsed next, large animals first, then small. The cycle of life fell apart. Some human groups were forced to hunt small primates, birds, even insects. Others dug deep into the soil, searching for the last remnants of edible roots. In the prolonged darkness, humanity grew weaker, both in body and spirit. And here, we begin to see what made this period a defining crossroads in human history: extreme selection pressure. Groups with stronger communication skills, better cooperation, more reliable fire mastery, or more durable tools were the only ones who survived. Groups that were weaker, even by a small margin, were eliminated by a nature utterly cold and devoid of mercy. Supervolcanoes did not merely destroy, they forced evolution. They pushed the human brain, already developing over millions of years, to its limits in order to devise new survival strategies. In the long darkness, humans needed intelligence to store food, to plan seasonal hunting, to identify safe shelters. As large animals disappeared, they had to adapt to hunting smaller, more elusive prey. As the environment changed relentlessly, they had to remember, share, and teach knowledge within their groups. All of this unintentionally accelerated the development of language, strategic thinking, and communal identity, traits that would later form the foundation of human civilization. But the cost was immense. Most branches of early humans went extinct during this era, or dwindled to numbers too small to recover. Archaeological records from later periods show a drastic drop in human sites across successive layers of sediment. Regions once rich with signs of habitation fell into complete silence. Early cultures were buried beneath volcanic ash forever. Yet the destruction did not last indefinitely. As the ash slowly settled, as faint sunlight returned, and as the ice withdrew from the plains, the planet entered a period of relative stability. And in that fragile window, the surviving human groups began to expand, adapt, and transform, laying the groundwork for more advanced forms of humanity. They survived, but not by luck. They survived through endurance, cooperation, adaptability, and a steadily sharpening intelligence. And because they survived, the next part of the story could unfold. For after the winters of darkness, humanity did not merely continue to exist, it began to revive. A new age was dawning, an age in which human ingenuity, unity, and resilience became the tools that led us out of a 117,000-year shadow. That journey begins in the next chapter. And it was in the midst of those ash-laden winters, when sunlight was smothered and life curled up into faint, trembling fragments, that humanity found itself facing an enemy far more frightening than volcanoes or climate. The fragility of its own body. Nature had already struck humans down with ice and darkness, but what came afterward revealed the true brutality of the million-year gap. For when the skies finally quieted, when the last veil of ash dissolved into the wind, invisible dangers, disease, competition, and genetic collapse, began to emerge, as if they had been waiting for the moment when humanity was most exhausted to make their move. If we imagine natural disasters as violent storms that sweep everything away, then disease and genetic decline are the quiet waters beneath, eroding the final foundations that remained. They were not deafening like magma, nor biting like the Pleistocene winds. Instead, they were silent, patient, and devastatingly effective, gradually weakening the ancient human groups that once possessed remarkable resilience. Modern geneticists have discovered that during this very gap period, the human population on Earth may have fallen to astonishingly low numbers, perhaps only a few thousand individuals, with some hypotheses suggesting even fewer. This was not merely a biological decline, it was a genetic collapse in the most literal sense. When a population shrinks so drastically, every child born ceases to be a product of diversity and instead becomes another repetition of a gene pool too small to maintain evolutionary strength. In such a turbulent environment, this was the equivalent of humanity stripping away its own armor. Without genetic diversity, the human body became vulnerable to even the smallest changes, a new virus, a pathogen from animals, or even a slight shift in climate. A community that once thrived could collapse within a few generations, losing fertility, weakening against disease, and no longer able to adapt. In that bleak picture, disease may have been the force that accelerated the downfall. Our ancestors lived in small bands, scattered thinly across the land. But when the population was squeezed into the few remaining habitable regions, where water still flowed and sparse resources remained, close contact between different human groups created ideal conditions for contagion. The pressure to survive pushed these groups toward one another, yet these very encounters made them vulnerable to diseases that no lineage had resistance to. And then, there were their rivals, other human species. Homo heidelbergensis, late-stage Homo erectus, and unnamed archaic human branches. All of them were desperate for resources, all driven by the same relentless climate, and each carried pathogens unfamiliar to the others. Every encounter between two groups of ancient humans was not only a struggle for food, territory, or mates, it was also an unintentional, often fatal exchange of viruses, bacteria, and unfamiliar pathogens that the opposing groups' bodies could not recognize. In such circumstances, competition was not merely physical conflict, it was biological warfare. The weaker groups were not necessarily destroyed in battle, they were erased by diseases for which they lacked genetic defenses. Even worse, each such loss further reduced humanity's gene pool, tightening the spiral of genetic decline. As scientists reconstructed ancient population patterns through modern DNA, they uncovered traces of genetic bottlenecks. Moments when the variety of genes passed down to future generations shrank sharply. These bottlenecks appear like scorch marks on the timeline, direct evidence that our ancestors brushed dangerously close to extinction. No one knows exactly which diseases raged through those ancient populations, but the genetic patterns leave one unavoidable conclusion: humanity once stood at a moment when perhaps only a few families survived, carrying the burden of rebuilding an entire species. Alongside disease, competition among human species reshaped the map of survival. Imagine a world where the robust, powerful Homo heidelbergensis roamed with advanced hunting tools, where Homo erectus stretched from Africa to Asia with extraordinary adaptability, and where early human groups struggled against the merciless climate. Each group sought life, each fought for the few regions that remained habitable. Such encounters were inevitable. The frightening truth is this: humanity did not always win. We may have been pushed back, displaced, driven into barren lands. What we retain today is proof that there were once human groups stronger than us, more physically capable, and perhaps more intelligent in ways suited to their era, yet they vanished, unable to survive the vicious combination of climate, disease, and competition. We are the last survivors. The deeper researchers probe into DNA, the clearer it becomes that humanity's survival was not a triumphant march but a long chain of chance events. One small group happened to outlive a random wave of disease. Another stumbled upon shelter before catastrophe struck. Every such moment formed the fragile threads connecting past to present. Had even one thread snapped, humans might not exist to tell this story. All of this shows that the million-year gap was not merely a blank space in history. It was the stage for the most brutal biological events our ancestors ever endured. There were no records, no memories, only genetics, the final fragments of truth left behind. And when we confront that evidence, one question rises: if diseases and genetic decline could push humanity so close to extinction, what allowed the surviving groups to endure, to grow stronger, to adapt, and to step into the next phase of evolution? The answer lies in the next chapter of history, where environmental change, climate upheavals, and the relentless pressure of survival converged into a decisive turning point for the entire human lineage. It would become the beginning of a transformation unlike anything before it, a moment when humanity did not merely survive, but began to be reborn. And just as humanity stepped away from that fragile biological brink, just as it seemed we had escaped the invisible seeds of disease and the genetic collapse threatening to erase our entire kind, a longer, darker ordeal began to unfold. This was no fleeting moment of life and death, no crisis contained within a handful of generations. It was a prolonged age of shadow stretching across hundreds of thousands of years. A period in which nature did not erupt violently like a supervolcano, nor crash suddenly like a shifting climate, but instead pressed its weight upon the world in silence, cold, persistent, and unrelenting, like a wound that would never heal. It was here that humanity had to learn how to survive in the dark, quite literally. Imagine waking to a morning where the sun no longer shines as it once did. A faint, weakened light slipping through a sky veiled in dust, colder, dimmer, until day becomes indistinguishable from an endless twilight. For our ancient ancestors, this was not fantasy. It was the reality of more than 117,000 years. This immense span of time is tied to the expansion of the glacial age, when colossal sheets of ice pushed down from the north and turned vast portions of the earth into a desert of frozen stone. But the true terror did not come only from the cold, it came from the lack of light. Climate and geological models suggest that heavy clouds of dust, volcanic haze, and natural aerosols veiled the atmosphere throughout this period, dimming the sun as if the entire sky had been covered by a colossal sheet of frosted glass. The dimming of sunlight did more than cool the earth, it caused life itself to shrink. Plants struggled to photosynthesize. Animals declined. And humans, dependent on both, were forced into small pockets of refuge where warmth and light still existed in just enough measure to sustain them. This created a harsh reality. Humanity no longer lived wide across continents but instead contracted into clusters, tiny populations separated by thousands of kilometers, like small flickers of flame scattered across an ever-darkening world. We cannot know precisely what life looked like, but from the fragments left behind, rough tools, ash pits inside caves, remains of small hunting parties, we can imagine its severity. Creativity and innovation became luxuries. Most human energy went into staying warm, finding food, and navigating the unending winter. Fire, once a companion, became a fragile boundary between survival and death. Hearths burned day and night within caves, smoldering for months as the only defense against a world that had turned hostile. Yet the most fearsome threat was not the cold, it was isolation. For 117,000 years, human groups lived almost completely cut off from one another. They sheltered in fog-covered valleys or on high plateaus where the sun appeared for only a handful of hours each day. There was no exchange of goods, no exchange of ideas, and no new genetic flow. Humanity was scattered across survival oases, where culture, skills, and even biology evolved slowly, not advancing, but enduring. Isolation made humans weaker, but it also made them profoundly alone. The world grew so vast and dangerous that large-scale hunting became impossible. Instead, humans adopted slower, more deliberate, and often desperate tactics. They tracked starving animals across ice-laden plains, braced against winds capable of killing a person in hours. One misjudgment, one poorly placed fire, one predator appearing at the wrong moment, any of these could erase an entire group overnight. And yet, paradoxically, within this age of darkness, humanity began to lay the groundwork for crucial advances. Rare archaeological traces suggest that groups learned to use every resource available, animal bones as tools, hides sewn into wind-resistant clothing, and temporary shelters built from stone or bone to reduce dependence on dwindling sunlight. Intelligence was no longer an advantage. It was a requirement for survival. What is most striking is that through all these millennia, humanity did not grow. There were no bursts of population. In fact, at times, numbers declined. Generations were born into shadow, grew up in relentless cold, and died just as they became old enough to hunt. Technology stagnated. Language, if it existed, evolved slowly. And the memory of a warmer, brighter world may have lingered only in stories whispered by elders, sounding like myths to children who had never seen the sun fully shine. This shrinking world reshaped the human mind. People grew cautious, resourceful, and fiercely focused on survival. Luxuries such as art, ritual, or territorial expansion nearly disappeared. All that remained was the will to live, a will they clung to for more than 117,000 years without faltering. What makes this period so haunting is its silence. There was no single eruption that darkened the skies overnight, no dramatic event marking its beginning or end. Instead, the entire Earth seemed to drift into a long sleep, and humans became the lone beings who remained awake, tending their fires, preserving their breath, waiting for dawn in a world that no longer seemed to care. And then, after more than 100,000 years of shrinking into darkness, the first signs of change appeared. Light strengthened. Climates warmed. Ice retreated northward. The world was waking up. And as the Earth opened its eyes once more, humanity also stepped into a new chapter of its evolution, stronger, sharper, and poised for the next trial. The lingering question is this: what happened when those survivors of the long darkness stepped into the light for the first time? What changed within their minds, their bodies, their perception of the world? The answer lies in the next chapter, where humankind rises from shadow and enters a completely new era of transformation. As the darkness began to lift, as the layers of ash gradually thinned enough for stronger light to reach the ground, the surviving human groups, those who had spent 117,000 years huddled in icy valleys and dim caverns, slowly realized that the world was changing. The winds felt less cutting. The earth softened in the spring. Animals returned along migration routes that had been broken for tens of thousands of years. A transformation was unfolding, slow yet unmistakably real, like a great creature stirring awake after an age-long slumber. And in that fragile moment of transition, the next chapter of humanity began: resurrection. There was no ringing bell to announce it, no grand event marking the shift. Humanity's resurrection did not come from a breakthrough invention or a sweeping revolution. It emerged from the very people who had endured unthinkable hardships. Their endurance, the last treasure they still possessed, became the foundation for the extraordinary rise of humankind around 813,000 years ago. As the climate stabilized, something deceptively simple but world-changing happened: the environment became predictable. Rivers flowed with the seasons, plants sprouted in cycles, and herds returned to the Great Plains. In this renewed world, the people who had survived the long cold suddenly held an advantage no other species could claim. The hard-won experience of living through the harshest conditions the earth could impose. They did not simply know how to find food, they knew how to track, how to conserve energy, how to work together with a unity unmatched by any predator. Resurrection began with skills that seemed old and familiar. But this time, they did not merely allow humans to survive, they enabled humans to triumph. Archaeological evidence from Africa, the Middle East, and Europe shows a clear advancement. Stone tools became more symmetrical, sharper, more refined. No longer were they large, crude shards used only for cracking bone. Instead, blades were crafted to precise dimensions, spearheads were perfectly balanced, and small chisels appeared for working wood and hide. This revealed a profound change in human thinking: tools were no longer made simply to survive, but to optimize survival. Fire, too, evolved beyond simple warmth inside caves. Around this period, traces of large-scale, controlled fire appear: patches of heat-altered stone, layers of compacted ash built up over many years. These signs show that humans had begun managing fire as a shared resource, for cooking, for deterring predators, for clearing vegetation, and even for attracting grazing animals. In doing so, they reshaped their environment to create more favorable hunting grounds. But humanity's resurrection was not powered by tools or techniques alone. What truly transformed history was the renewal of social networks. After more than 100,000 years of isolation, humans were finally able to migrate, meet, and exchange knowledge. And when groups began to encounter one another again, something extraordinary happened. Knowledge did not merely persist, it multiplied. Each group carried its own expertise: how to build wind-resistant shelters, how to track migrating herds, how to craft micro-tools, how to store food in ice. When these skills were exchanged, humanity experienced a leap in cognition. Population also began to grow at a pace unseen during the entire 117,000 years before. From a few thousand scattered individuals, researchers estimate that humans rose to tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands within several climatic cycles. This meant one thing: in a stable environment with renewed social contact, humans could recover faster than any large-brained species known to science. Rising population brought another transformation: cooperation expanded. Groups were no longer limited to 15 or 30 individuals, they could form communities of hundreds. This changed how they hunted, how they migrated, and how they taught one another. Persistence hunting, the uniquely human strategy based on endurance, reached a new scale. Instead of a few hunters pursuing a single animal, entire groups could encircle large herds, driving them into disadvantageous terrain and bringing down many at once. This was the moment humans shifted from a species on the brink of extinction to a species poised to dominate the food chain. During this same era, archaeologists noticed signs of an important psychological shift. Humans began to remember and mark the world around them. Repeated layers of ash at specific sites indicate they returned to the same places each season, an early form of settlement. Within these hearths, pieces of wood were found neatly arranged, evidence of spatial organization and communal order. All of this leads to one clear conclusion: humanity's resurrection was not accidental. It was the outcome of hundreds of thousands of years of trial, of intelligence forged in darkness, and of a capacity for cooperation unmatched by any other life form. This resurrection became the foundation for something even greater: the emergence of more advanced human species, groups who would migrate farther, expand wider, and leave an indelible mark on the history of evolution. But one question remains: what did this resurrection ultimately lead to? After surviving catastrophe after catastrophe, what did early humans carry with them into the future? The answer lies in the next part, where we uncover the legacy left behind by the remaining 1,280 individuals who became the ancestors of all humankind today. When the previous chapter closed with humanity rising from the edge of extinction, it felt as though the journey had already reached its deepest, longest, and most tumultuous point. But it had not. Because after that resurrection, after the extraordinary return of a species standing mere steps from oblivion, there remained a story even larger than survival. A story not rooted in tragedy, nor in miracle, but in the very essence of who we are. And that is where the path leads us into Chapter 10, where the legacy of the 1,280 survivors reveals a truth more powerful and haunting than any chapter before it. Have you ever wondered, what if all of humanity today, from billions of people of every ethnicity, every civilization, every faith, traced its origins back to just over 1,000 individuals? And not as a hypothetical or a mythic tale, but as a scientific fact written into our very DNA? The question sounds like the beginning of a legend, yet science has confirmed it with the cold clarity of data and with the genetic architecture each of us carries within our bodies. Around 1,280 human beings, a number so small it feels suffocating, survived the harshest collapse our species ever faced. These were the souls who endured disease, food scarcity, brutal climate swings, and a battle for survival so prolonged it made time itself feel like a second enemy. But more importantly, they did not merely survive, they became the common ancestors of every one of us. The existence of humanity today is the direct result of natural selection in that era, selection so severe it was nearly absolute. Strangely, their legacy is not found in crude tools, not in tales scratched on stone, not in the remnants of ancient shelters. Their most profound legacy lies within us, in our genetic code, once constricted, then rebuilt, then expanded again over tens of thousands of years. Every trait you carry today, your eye color, the structure of your bones, your immune responses, bears the imprint of a time when humanity was so diminished that a single storm or an unusually long winter could have erased us forever. When the human population collapsed to roughly 1,280 individuals, genetic diversity, the very foundation of evolutionary strength, crashed to near zero. Humanity became a lone, fragile cluster, like an ancient tree stripped of its branches, left with only a few thin limbs stubbornly clinging to life. And the brutal truth is this: from those fragile branches, the vast forest of humankind grew back. That is why modern science has discovered something remarkable. Compared with many other species, humans possess an unusually low level of genetic diversity. We differ in culture, language, and way of life, yet biologically we resemble one another to a degree that astonishes geneticists. A single group of chimpanzees in an African rainforest displays greater genetic variation than the entire human population of Earth. It sounds like a paradox, but it is, in fact, the clearest evidence of the greatest evolutionary bottleneck our species ever endured. And yet, instead of viewing this as weakness, we can see it as a triumph of evolution. For even with our genetic constraints, humanity did not simply persist, we rose to dominate the planet. It proves something essential: survival is not solely a matter of numbers, but of adaptation and unyielding perseverance. Those survivors, the 1,280 individuals, had no modern weapons, no medical knowledge, no advanced tools, not even a complete language like ours. And still they walked through the darkest era armed with instinctive intelligence, collective strength, and the ability to pass down hard-earned survival wisdom from one generation to the next. They did not know they were fighting for the future of billions, they only knew they could not afford to fall. And that nameless resilience became the bridge that carried humanity across the abyss. What makes their legacy so tragic and grand is that it exists in absolute silence. There are no monuments bearing their names. No artifacts tell their stories. No one knows who they were, where they lived, whom they loved, whom they lost, or what terrors they faced. Yet every one of us, from barefoot children running in African fields, to scientists in European laboratories, to citizens of crowded Asian megacities, carries them in our blood. Their legacy is not only a story of survival, it is a reminder that humanity was once so fragile it defies imagination. Every achievement of today, science, art, culture, philosophy, began with a path forged by a group so small they could have vanished with a single brutal season. But from that humble beginning, humanity proved that intellect and willpower can compensate for genetic limitations. We were not blessed with strength in numbers, but we ascended through memory, culture, cooperation, and creativity, forces that do not reside in genes yet spread across generations with far greater resilience than any biological inheritance. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of the 1,280 survivors: they passed down more than DNA. They passed down an unbreakable instinct to endure, an instinct that refuses to surrender, whether the enemy is climate, disease, predators, or time itself. Today, when we look back, we see not only the fragility of our past but also the boundless resilience of our species. That legacy lives on in every child born, in every scientific breakthrough, in every new civilization built upon the old. It tells us that no matter how the world changes, no matter how vast the challenges ahead may be, humanity carries within its core a history of rebirth, of rising from the very edge of despair. And that is why understanding the legacy of those 1,280 ancestors is not merely understanding the past, it is recognizing the strength that lives within us today. No words can record their names. But our very existence stands as the greatest monument ever created in their honor. As our journey through the mysterious 1 million-year gap comes to a close, we are still left standing before a question without an answer: what truly happened during that shadowed era of human history? This is not merely a missing fragment of time, but a key, one that could unlock secrets capable of reshaping everything we believe about our origins and evolution. And I promise you this: what lies ahead is far stranger, deeper, and more astonishing than anything we have uncovered so far. If you feel a slight shiver, a lingering doubt, or even an unexplainable pull when thinking about that void, then that is the emotion history has left for us, an invitation to explore that never truly ends. Because every mystery revealed is not a conclusion, but the beginning of an even greater question. So do not forget to follow the journey ahead. Subscribe to the channel, and let each night be another moment where we open new chapters of history together. Stories gentle enough to lull you to sleep, yet mysterious enough to keep your thoughts quietly wandering long after the narration fades.